Hello there, Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. I'm here with no other person than Dimitri Lascaris. He is a lawyer, independent journalist, eco-socialist. He is based in both Montreal, Canada, and Kalamata, Greece. Dimitri, thanks for joining the Canada Files.
Thank you for having me, Aiden. Always a pleasure.
All right, Dimitri. Well, so much to talk about, and let's start with Lebanon. So you've been in Lebanon 4 times in the past 2 years. Is that correct?
I've been there 4 times since October of last year, since this genocide began in Gaza. I've been there 5 times. In total, my first visit was in the first quarter of last year. So in the last 18 months or so, I've been there 5 times.
Okay, Dimitri. So can you tell Canadians why you've chosen to report there so often?
Well, the first time that I went there, I there obviously didn't know what was about to transpire in Palestine, and my reasons for going there were partly related to Palestine, but I was mostly focused upon the economic crisis. It's experiencing an absolutely crushing inflationary spiral. The electricity system is largely collapsed and is more or less now operated by generators, privately owned generators for those who can afford them. The country was also reeling from this massive explosion in the port of Beirut, which did immense damage. And I'd never been there before, and it was obviously a place that has been pivotal in the various struggles in West Asia. So that's why I went the first time. And then in the course of going there, I went down to the south, visited the border wall, and I also went to the Shatila refugee camp where a massacre happened, orchestrated by the Israelis back in the 1980s, I believe it was. Um, and began to understand, really at the very beginning of understanding the depth and the diversity of resistance groups within the country. And then when the genocide began in October, and Hezbollah and other resistance, not just Hezbollah, there are other resistance groups operating in South Lebanon, began to attack Israeli military targets to assist the Palestinians in Gaza. I went down there because I wanted to find out what was going on in the war zone. That was the primary purpose for my going there in the last 4 times. And it's easier for me to operate there, frankly, as dangerous as it is, than it is. I also went to Palestine in March of this year. And I was very surprised that I didn't encounter any hostility, at least none that I saw, from the Israeli military or intelligence services. But I think it's safe to say that I have greater freedom of speech and latitude in South Lebanon than I do in Palestine because of the Israeli authorities. So that's why I've focused on Lebanon rather than Palestine during the last few months.
Right. So you've seen funerals in Lebanon, you've seen border villages attacked by Israel, and so much more. So how's reporting from Lebanon impacted your views on the axis of resistance, Western imperialism, and this push for a multipolar world?
It's impacted it in a number of ways. First of all, I had the opportunity to, I mean, it wasn't just this, but it was quite informative. I had the opportunity to interview the international relations director of Hezbollah, and I asked him about the attitude of the organization towards the Jewish people, towards the state of Israel, about the prospects for peaceful coexistence, about the allegations of terrorism against the organization. And what I found his answers to be sincere and credible, was that the depiction of Hezbollah in the mainstream media, not surprising to somebody like yourself, a journalist like yourself, Aiden, I'm sure, is highly misleading. And I actually witnessed attacks on Israeli military targets myself when I was in South Lebanon, particularly on the base of Metula. And all of the reports that are coming out of the resistance, stress that they are attacking military targets. And obviously, this is of a state that is committing genocide. I have seen no evidence during the time that I've down there. I'm not saying it's never happened, but during the time that I've down there, I saw no evidence that they're attacking civilian targets or trying to. There have been civilian casualties but they are relatively small compared to the civilian casualties that Israel has caused. And Israel claims to be engaged in precision strikes. I have real questions in my mind about the legitimacy of designating these organizations as terrorist organizations. Basically, Israel and Western states designate anyone, any person, any individual who takes up arms against the state of Israel, the military of Israel, as a terrorist, even if they only target military personnel or military facilities. And you see this in the Israeli press. So this is something that we need to, I think we need to be having a discussion about in the West. And we're not having that discussion, and I'm trying to, stimulate one. Another thing that I learned from speaking with people in Lebanon is that I really have the sense that there's a higher degree of free speech in Lebanon today than there is in Western countries. And everyone I spoke to there says you can say pretty much anything you want about anybody. And I asked specifically people who are not supporters of Hezbollah, can you criticize Hezbollah? And they gave me specific examples of people who had said very damning things about Hezbollah in the recent past, prominent, influential people, and nothing happened to them. And at the same time, we're seeing in the West, people like Richard Medhurst, Pavel Durov, Scott Ritter being arrested, being harassed, having their homes raided, Sarah Wilkinson in the United Kingdom as well. We saw the horrors that were inflicted upon Julian Assange for doing nothing other than journalism and revealing the criminal secrets of the United States military. So it's actually a country, it seems to me, where there is a higher degree of freedom of speech at this moment than there is in the West. And the last thing I'll say is I was extraordinarily impressed by the resilience of the civilian population. And I'll highlight one particular journalistic experience I had. I went on my last trip to a border village called Aita Ashab, which is 1 kilometer from the Israeli border. It's been evacuated. Few, if any, Western journalists have gotten in there over the past 10 months. I'm not aware of any having gotten in. And the reason why I was able to get in primarily was because there was a funeral that day for an Islamic resistance fighter who had been killed in an Israeli drone strike on the prior day. And so hundreds and hundreds of villagers returned to the village temporarily to attend his funeral. And we, myself and my guide, Hadi Hotait, and the Lebanese journalist, accompanied them by vehicle into the village. We observed part of the funeral, but spent most of our time surveying the damage. And the damage was absolutely extraordinary, just devastating. One house after another destroyed, businesses destroyed, electrical infrastructure destroyed, industrial facilities destroyed. And while we were there, people were almost, while at the same time, mourning the passing of this fighter, they were almost jovial in terms of how they dealt with us. They were incredibly hospitable and wanted to make us feel welcome in their homes. And every single one of them voiced their determination to defeat Israel, even though they were living and walking amongst the ruins of their community. And many of them had been killed. The people had lost family members and friends, not just this Islamic resistance fighter. That was quite impressive to me, and to see people in the West, they talk about, for example, people who are Zionists on university campuses claiming that they're not safe. They're made unsafe by the fact that people wear keffiyehs or people chant intifada, which simply means shaking off. That's unsafe. I'll tell you what unsafe is. Unsafe is coming back to Aita Ashab, which lies just 2 or 3 kilometers from an Israeli military base, and taking the elevated risk of having your life snuffed out in a moment by a drone strike. That's unsafe.
So you've met many principled pro-resistance journalists in West Asia. I'm thinking about Gadi Francis, Ali Mortada, Marwa Osman, among others. But the Canadian journalist most controversial, he's in West Asia, is Laith Marouf of Free Palestine TV. I co-host a weekly show with him for the Canada Files, Canada and Palestine, the War on Zionism. So can you talk about how you connected with Marouf and chose to work with him regularly, despite what you would probably know is a good number of domestic complaints?
I first met Laith, I think about 5 or 6 years ago when I was invited to a dinner at somebody's residence in Montreal, somebody who's an activist and anti-imperialist who knew both of us, but I'd never met him before then. And, there were probably about 10 or 15 people at that dinner, and he and I chatted briefly, and that was it. I never encountered him again. I did see some press reports about him in the last 2 or 3 years, which were quite unflattering in Canada. And then when I came to Lebanon, I believe the first time or the second time I came to Lebanon last year, he had by that point in time moved to Beirut, and he learned from my social media commentary that I was in the country. So he contacted me, and I went out to dinner with him, and I found him to be a very charming, insightful, and provocative individual. This is the first time I had a real face-to-face conversation with him. And that was it. And then the next time I came to Lebanon, he actually accompanied me. He offered to accompany me. I was going with a fixer to Damascus from Beirut for a day trip. And he came along, and he's Palestinian Syrian, and has spent years in Syria and has a deep, deep understanding of the country. And I found his analysis to be extremely enlightening, his analysis about Syria, which is a very complex country. So at that point, I decided that, it would be useful for me to have a professional relationship with Laith because of his knowledge of the region. And I began to interview him periodically on my YouTube program, Reason to Resist. And shortly after I did that, I started to take a lot of heat from people in Canada, people who are supporters of the Palestinian cause and people who are friends of mine. And I think it's fair to say that Laith has he has an irascible style. He's very outspoken. I don't agree with everything he has said by any means, and his criticisms of certain of the individuals and groups who are active in the Palestinian solidarity movement, I do not agree with. But I think that Laith nonetheless has a lot to offer. I don't have a friend I agree with on everything. I have no such friend. Every friend I have, there are disagreements that we have. Sometimes heated intellectual disagreements. So the fact that I don't agree with Laith on everything doesn't alter the fact that he is an extremely insightful person. He's also a person of extraordinary courage, I must tell you. I've seen him in the war zone. I was with him in the war zone, and I admire journalists of courage. I admire journalists who are outspoken, even when I don't agree with them. And so I don't believe that the fundamental allegations that have been made against him, that he's anti-Semitic, have any weight whatsoever. I gave him an opportunity, my very first interview of him, to respond to these allegations. I found his responses to be sensible, and I think he is being intentionally or unintentionally misconstrued by people who have, shall we say, other grievances or other agendas. And I think people ought to, revisit. If they have a negative opinion about Laith, they should revisit their opinion and value the contributions that they can make, because they're very significant.
All right, thanks, Dimitri. So can you talk about your impressions of the pro-resistance journalists you've met in West Asia and how they'll inform your future journalism?
The first word that comes to mind is courage. I mean, unbelievable courage. And the most audacious of them is Ali Mortada, who is a war correspondent for a Lebanese-based media organization called Al Mayadeen. Al Mayadeen was founded in 2012, I think it is, by a number of Al Jazeera Arabic reporters and hosts who were highly dissatisfied by the Qatari-based organization's coverage of the war in Syria. And since then, Ali has been going right up to the front line, including many times during this genocide, and challenging the Israelis, openly challenging them and their narrative. He has I think it's a weekly, maybe even a daily segment he does, which he calls Hello, My Enemies. He starts by using those words. He's addressing himself to the population of Israel, and then he proceeds to openly mock whatever fake narrative is coming out of the Israeli military. For example, the Israeli military tells Israelis that Lebanese people have moved away from the border. And on the very, very frontline villages like Ait el-Shab, which is 1 kilometer from the border and has been devastated, yes, there has been an evacuation, understandably so. But, even just 4 or 5 kilometers in, you see, I've been to these communities, places like Nabatia, Bin Jbeil, where many people remain and just go about their daily lives. So Ali Mortadez was saying to the Israelis, look, I can see the Israeli settlement of Metula standing here as I am on the border. I can see Manada. I'm a Lebanese person. I don't see your military anywhere. Where are they? Where are your people? I don't see them. These places are ghost towns. But on my side of the border, people are living and going about their businesses, even with their children in their communities. So that's the kind of thing that he does. 2 Al-Mayadeen journalists were killed last year by an Israeli strike. So this is a man who's taking his life into his own hands. And he talks about the fact that the Israeli military has murdered 170 journalists in Gaza in the past 11 months. 170 journalists, in a number of cases, killed their family members as well. So he's literally taking his life into his own hands. I commend to you the interview I did of Ali Motada about a week or two ago. It's on my YouTube channel, Reason to Resist, and you can hear from him why he does it. It's quite impressive. And, this is the general view I have of one journalist after another I met who has a resistance-oriented perspective. These are people of extraordinary courage, and they're very eloquent and very, very knowledgeable about the region, and they have much to teach us.
Right, Dimitri. So speaking of future journalism, we're heading into a tense period. You have the attack on Richard Medhurst by UK authorities using terrorism legislation. You have Scott Ritter being targeted again by US authorities. The UK has already targeted excellent Grey Zone journalist and Canada Files Advisory Board member Kate Clarenberg previously. So these latest attacks on Medhurst and Ritter, what do you think they indicate about the future of doing journalism opposing Western imperialism while actually being in the West?
Our right to free speech is under a full-blown assault, such as I've never seen in my lifetime, Aiden. I mean, I was born in the 60s. I'm astonished, shocked at what I'm watching. The things that are being removed from the internet, what was done to Julian Assange, journalists being arrested under terrorism legislation. Richard Medhurst was met by 6 police officers at Heathrow Airport. Why? Because under Section 12 of that legislation, the Terrorism Act of 2000, you could go to prison for up to 14 years for expressing support for a prohibited organization. Those are very, very broad words. What does that mean, expressing support? And let's just think about what the implications of that are. Imagine that you disagree with the government choosing to designate a certain group as a terrorist organization. And obviously, being designated as a terrorist organization is a devastating allegation. You could be banned, your corporate charter could be revoked, your assets could be seized, the leaders of the organization can be sent away to prison for many years. Your social media account shut down. So it's a very, very serious allegation by the government. If you disagree with that and you say, look, the grounds upon which you have designated this group as a terrorist organization are non-existent or erroneous, you could easily be interpreted to be supporting that organization by opposing its being designated as a terrorist organization. Of course, many people would say you're supporting the organization. So what that legislation does is it basically criminalizes disagreements with the government about how what groups it chooses to designate as terrorist organizations. And if you can't challenge a government's decision to designate somebody as a terrorist organization, you are conferring upon the government enormous power, enormous power. We should have the ability to contest these designations, to challenge them, and to say that the organization is not what the government is alleging it to be. The way the government should deal with this, if we're wrong, is to debate us, to put forward the evidence supporting the designation, debate us, discredit us if we're wrong, use the powers of persuasion. That's what democracy is all about. But instead, what the government is doing is it's sending people to prison or threatening to do so. And I think we are, frankly, on the slippery slope to fascism. That's exactly where we're heading. And I was just commenting the other day in an interview that I did. There have been thousands of protests in the West over the past 11 months about the genocide in Gaza, understandably so. But I don't remember the last time that I have seen or heard about in any Western country a protest about free speech, about the assault on our free speech rights. People need to wake up. They need to understand that this is the prerequisite to all that we hold dear, our ability to speak freely. If we can't speak freely, everything that we hold dear is at risk. And it's time for us to get into the streets collectively, whether we agree or we don't agree with the people who are being silenced. That's not the issue. The issue is the right to speak, the right to express yourself, the right to dissent. And that is something that we should all be standing together, shoulder to shoulder, defending in the streets, whatever we may think of each other's political ideas.
Right, so I'm thinking about Canada. You wrote about Bill C-70, the Anti-Foreign Interference Act, and I think you've intelligently focused on the intimidation aspect that's been added in to the Security of Information Act legislation. This undefined intimidation, right? One of the problems here is it's for the benefit of a foreign entity or terrorist group. Let's say, for example, Hezbollah or Palestinian resistance, right? I'm thinking that a journalist like me, hell, like you, could potentially be prosecuted, and that's life imprisonment under this act. This issue I think this is an early warning to Canadians rather than this is not a separate thing. This is coming for us just as fast as it is for the Brits. They're just a couple months, I think, at best ahead of us. I'm just curious what you think.
Well, I think that the reason why the Brits are exhibiting, I believe, in the most aggressive forms of censorship in the West is because they don't have a constitutional charter that protects civil liberties. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If we didn't have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I think we would be right there, shoulder to shoulder with the British fascists trying to shut down dissent just as aggressively as they are. But the government is constrained in its ability to do that. And I think it's trying to, in a very nefarious way, trying to find ways to work around the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But this particular legislation you mentioned, and if they ever come after me under that legislation, I assure you, Aidan, the very first thing I'm going to do is challenge it under the right to free speech of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And we'll have it out in a court of law. I want the authorities to understand this clearly. I have both the wherewithal and the determination to fight this in the court of law, and I will. One particularly, I think, a dramatic example of how this legislation could be misused is that a few months ago, peaceful pro-Palestinian protesters determined where Melanie Joly, the foreign minister of Canada, resides in Montreal. And they went to her neighborhood and they stood outside her home. My understanding is they weren't on the property, they were on public property, and peacefully criticized Joly and her government for continuing to support Israel, including by sending weapons directly and indirectly to the genocidal regime. There was no vandalism, there were no threats of violence, there was no violence, no trespassing even, as far as I know. And yet the reaction across the political spectrum, including from Heather McPherson, the foreign affairs critic of the supposedly left-wing NDP, was bitter condemnation that these people had gone to her home. And this was characterized as intimidation and harassment. There also was an incident in which Eve Engler, author and activist Eve Engler, just happened to come across, I think it was Marc Garneau, in the streets of Montreal, put a microphone or an iPhone in front of him and asked him repeatedly to justify, I think he was the foreign minister at the time, to justify Canada's support for Israel. And the next day, our CMP officer showed up at Eve Engler's home, and as I understand it, suggested to Eve that he was intimidating or harassing the minister and tried to send a message to him. So this concept of intimidation is so broad. And I myself have, had occasion on numerous occasions to challenge ministers and the prime minister himself in public with, aggressive questioning, but in a completely from the perspective of physical intimidation. There was absolutely nothing in what I did that was physically intimidating. My questions, however, were persistent and they were forceful, and I wouldn't stop until I was removed from the premises because they didn't want to answer. And in every occasion, I was physically removed from the premises. I could easily see the police trying to characterize this as intimidation. This is a very broad, amorphous concept. And if you are saying things like, let me give you an example of something I say all the time. How can you designate Hezbollah or Hamas as a terrorist organization and not designate the state of Israel as a terrorist entity when it has killed and targeted vastly more civilians and destroyed vastly more civilian infrastructure for its political objective of Zionism and dispossessing, effectively removing Palestinians from historic Palestine? How can you do that? That makes absolutely no sense. I could easily see somebody saying, well, that's, supporting a terrorist organization, and you are using methods that are quote unquote intimidating. So we're going to prosecute you under this law. This is a very, very dangerous law. And the penalties are very steep. You could go to jail for up to 25 years, or I think in some cases even life imprisonment. And I want to just raise one other question, Aidan, for people to think about. Why do we, as a society, regard crimes that are done for a political purpose, crimes of violence done for a political purpose, as being worse than crimes done for a non-political purpose? So if you, let's suppose you're a Palestinian militant and you kill Israeli civilians out of anger or revenge for what is being done to your own people. Under our definition of terrorism, because it's the motivation for it is political, you are the worst type of criminal. Now let's imagine a situation where somebody kills somebody simply because they want their money, and they don't need the money. They have money, the killer, but they want more. And so they just, some random person in the street who happens to have $500 in his pocket, they slit his throat, they shoot him in the heart, they kill him, and take the money and run away. I don't understand why we treat the person who commits the act of violence for a political objective as more evil, more reprehensible than the person who does it for a non-political objective. I think we should ask ourselves whether, I'm not suggesting that either of these acts of violence is justifiable. I never would condone, sanction the use of violence against innocent civilians. I condemn it in all circumstances. But I actually think that the more culpable killer is the one who does it for the non-political objective. These are the kinds of conversations we should be having. What is terrorism at the end of the day, and to what use is it being put, and is it in fact being applied consistently? What is the true reason for which this anti-terror legislation is being adopted? Is it actually to keep us safer, or is it to shut us up and to support the worst terrorists on planet Earth, which are the US government and the Israeli government at this particular moment in history? These are the questions and the conversations we should be having, and this legislation is designed to prevent those conversations from taking place.
Right. So I asked the last question because supporting Palestine is more and more openly triggering the rage of Canadian politicians. I'm thinking about Liberal MP Marco Mendicino. He wants his good old safety spaces, and also wants a Canadian who writes Israelis, the new Nazis, to be persecuted and thrown in jail. Meanwhile, weeks earlier, the Canadian government boycotted a Nagasaki ceremony to honor the victims of the atomic bomb because the Zionist regime wasn't invited to participate. So can you give the audience your thoughts on the escalating depravity of Canada's ruling elite and its active support for the Zionist regime?
To appreciate the shocking depravity of Canada's political elite, all you have to do is remember what happened in September of last year, when Mr. Mendicino and pretty much all his colleagues, whoever was present in the Liberal Party caucus, and all the Conservatives, and as I understand it, most of the NDP, most, if not all, of the members of the Bloc, virtually the entirety of Canada's Parliament gave 2 standing ovations to a Nazi, Jaroslav Hunka, somebody who was known to have volunteered for the Galicia Waffen SS during the Second World War, a branch of the German SS, and worked in their service. This Nazi entity organization is responsible for the murder of tens of thousands of Poles and Jews and Russians in the Second World War. This man not only volunteered for this organization, Jaroslav Hunka, during the Second World War, but he bragged about it afterwards. It was publicly known that this man had volunteered and bragged about it, and Canada's Parliament gave him 2 standing ovations. This is the same government that has voted repeatedly against a United Nations General Assembly resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. This is the same government whose military was found by the Ottawa Citizen, a mainstream Canadian newspaper, to have been training neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military. These people are showing more and more signs of being sympathetic to Nazism, the people who run our country. And so for them to condemn people for using and condemning, those who are engaging in Nazi-like behavior, and I'll say unequivocally, Israel is engaging in Nazi-like behavior. Absolutely. Shooting children in the head, raping detainees, and then afterwards, when they are arrested simply because they had the depravity to videotape what they did, and the videotape came to light, they were arrested. What happens? Dozens of these lunatics, these fascist lunatics, descend upon the Israeli military base to try to get the arrestees liberated. And they just put a poll out which showed that 65% of Israeli Jews are opposed to prosecution of soldiers, Israeli soldiers, who are accused of raping Palestinian detainees. This is not Nazism. Looks a hell of a lot like Nazism to me. And who is Marco Mendicino?
Speaking of for Canada, for the Nazi, I think there's 2 elements that make it even worse. So there's been no effort or interest in prosecuting Hunka in Canada in the first place for committing war crimes. Which, look, he's part of a Nazi SS division. This is a flat-out guarantee that he was part of war crimes, one way or another. And also you had Canada's Parliament they pretty much had like a struggle session on how to prevent similar embarrassment. Not that it was bad. Not that it was bad that we honored a Nazi in Parliament, but how to catch these things to not have these things go to the public. You had Lubomir Lusiuk, this Nazi apologist professor, Royal Military College of Canada, defending Hunka. You had the Ukrainian Canadian Congress defending Hunka. These things got so wild in this committee, by the way, that CIJA, Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, hardcore Zionists, they complained about Hunka's honoring, and Lusiuk pretty much told them to shut up. That's the depravity. The Zionist Nazis are being told to shut up by the Ukrainian Nazis. That's a pretty good summary of Canada's politics, in addition to the honoring of Hunka in Parliament.
Yeah. I'd laugh just as an aside, Aidan. Andrew Coyne, I believe he's now a columnist for the Globe and Mail, who regularly appears on CBC news programs or political analysis programs. He has the Ukrainian and Israeli flags in his Twitter profile. What's really shocked me the most, I think, about what's happened to Canada in the last 11 months is that none of the people who have historically been outspoken defenders in the so-called mainstream of Israel have changed their views. They have not resiled from them at all. And in fact, their support for Israel seems to have intensified. That's scary. It's really frightening. It should concern deeply all Canadians, whatever you think about the Palestinian cause, however much importance you attach to it or don't attach to it, to have people who are dominating the public discourse in the country, supporting an openly genocidal regime and calling for the silencing of those who criticize it. That's frightening. Scares the hell out of me.
For sure, and I think you've seen the news with Jeremy Levy getting the ability to set up his own little militia, right? That is kind of the way things are heading in Canada. But I do have some other questions for you that I want to get through. Actually, one final one, and it deserves a lot of focus for the audience. Dimitri, how would you want to see Canadians escalate their protests and opposition to Canada's support to the Zionist regime as Israel ramps up its genocidal killings in the face of the axis of resistance. I know you talk about free speech, but I think there's more that can be done.
Well, ironically, we can take some inspiration from what the Israelis are doing today, not for the right reasons, and that is they are holding a general strike. The largest trade union in the country called for a general strike because it believes that, with complete justification, that the Netanyahu regime is more interested in prolonging the war, a war which has gone completely off the rails and which Israel is losing all over the place, than returning the hostages that are currently in the custody of Palestinian militants in Gaza. They're holding a general strike. That's what we need to see in Canada. And as I say, I think the very first thing we should hold a general strike over is the assault on our free right to speak freely. And secondarily, there are ways to disrupt the economy short of a general strike. So, for example, you can go to a place like the General Dynamics factory in London, Ontario, where I was born and raised and lived for many years, which produces, for example, weaponized personnel carriers for the Saudi regime, one of the most murderous and repressive regimes in the world, and form a human chain around it. You don't have to damage property, but form a human chain around it, impede the inflow and outflow of goods from the industrial equipment and supplies into and out from the facility. Disrupt the economy, disrupt the functioning. And my advice to you, if you're inclined to engage in this kind of civil disobedience, is try to avoid causing, to the maximum degree possible, try to avoid causing disruption to the lives of innocent Canadians. Be very focused. Go after the corporate facilities, the corporations, and the executives of these corporations with peaceful civil disobedience to disrupt the functioning of their organizations. And that will, I think, start to get the attention of the government. Now, I want to be very clear that anybody who engages in this sort of conduct, this sort of civil disobedience, whether or not they do anything that could constitute or be said to constitute a threat of violence or engage in violence, and I strongly discourage you from doing either of those things. Don't engage in violence, don't threaten violence, and even if they refrain from destroying or vandalizing property, which is a very risky thing to do in the current climate, even if all they do is just by using their bodies, they disrupt the functioning of an industrial enterprise or, let's say, a bank office, they're taking the risk of being arrested. We should have no illusions about that. They could be charged. They could even be convicted in the current climate. So no one should think that by engaging in disruption of the businesses that are complicit in crimes against humanity and war crimes, that they're going to be left alone. But the stakes are such that we, in my opinion, need to up our game. We need to actually cause financial consequences, negative financial consequences to the corporations that are driving the war, the murder, the silencing, the repression. And if we don't do that, if all we do is continue to hold all of these peaceful protests in an orderly way, not disrupt the economy, but look at how they've responded, Aidan, after we've held, I would say at this point, there's been well in excess of 1,000 protests in Canada. Who knows, probably thousands at this stage since October of last year in support of the Palestinian cause, all over the country, in small communities, major cities, mid-sized cities. What has happened? Has this changed the government's support for Palestine, for the Israelis? Not at all. They're still sending weapons. They're still conferring trade benefits on organization, on entities that are operating in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank. They're still refusing to impose sanctions on any government leader in Israel, any military leader in Israel. I mean, the only thing they've done was that they withdrew the charitable status of the Jewish National Fund. That's it. And although that's a significant victory for the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, that isn't going to change Israel's behavior one iota. The government would have to go far further than that. So they basically are thumbing their nose at all the protests we've done. Clearly, this is not enough. It's not enough. We have to up our game. We have to escalate. We have to cause disruption to the economy and particularly to the operations of these complicit businesses.
All right, Dimitri. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to the Canada Files. I would just ask if there's any message you'd want to leave with the audience.
Your freedom is at risk. Act now before it's too late.
All right, Dimitri. Well, thank you very much for speaking with the Canada Files. Now, Dimitri has a YouTube channel, Right to Resist. He's on Twitter. You're also your YouTube channel. People can also find the content on Rumble there as well. Is there any other platforms that people should know of?
I have a TikTok account. I don't know if you mentioned Instagram. My handle there is at Dimitri Lascaris, same one as I have on X or Twitter. I'm also on Facebook, but that's not particularly useful nowadays because I have the strong impression that I've been shadow banned by Facebook. So in any event, the main place to go if you want to follow my content is YouTube, my Reason to Resist channel, and my X account.
All right. Well, thanks, Dimitri, for taking the time to speak to the Canada Files. Canada Files audience, if you appreciate the journalism, please do support it. And we're going to leave it there. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Take care.